This is over here. To have a world-renowned speaker with us, Rabbi Jacobson. I'd just like to welcome Rabbi Mendel Silverstein, who's also with us. Our Chabad friend from the Chabad of Mamaroneck Larchmont. So, and I know a lot of the people that are attending are from his Chabad house. So it's wonderful. It's also an honor to have everyone come together as a community to be all here this evening. I want to thank Karen and Mitch for sponsoring Rabbi Jacobson, for having him here this evening. I mean, I was first introduced to Rabbi Jacobson right here at this address at 91 Union Avenue. Rabbi Jacobson even mentioned to me before, he says, where was this before? When I came here, he came here 25 years ago. And there was a woman here at the time, Hillary Markowitz, and I happened to mention something about Gilgulim, which means reincarnations, in one of my sermons. And she said to me, she asked me a question, and I said, it's above my purview. It's above my pay grade. Don't get me started with reincarnation. I can't answer any of those questions. And there were two people listening, and they said, well, there's a person, a rabbi, who gives lectures on reincarnation. You should actually bring him here. I said, I'd love to. You know, please, let's have him here. So Rabbi Jacobson was introduced to me 25 years ago. And it's before we had this building. We were in a single family home at the time. And he came here to lecture on that. I remember the flyers that we put out, that we're going to learn about reincarnation. If you want, you can bring your dogs, your cats, be nice to them. You never know who they are, who they were. So I remember the flyer that was put out at the time, and people had so many questions. And I said, it's such a, metaphysical, esoteric subject. I said, who could ever answer the questions? And I was mesmerized that evening, just listening to Rabbi Jacobson explain such a difficult, complex idea. And it was just flowing out of his mouth. I'm sure Karen's Koflik, when she introduces him, she's going to say that Rabbi Jacobson was one of the few people selected because of his immense photographic memory that he has, that you cannot take notes or write on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. Rabbi Jacobson was one of the people that would sit next to the Rebbe when he would farbring, when he would lecture on Shabbos, and he would remember everything the Rebbe said. So that way they were able to transcribe it onto paper and to write it in books, and which later became, I guess, the Likutei Sichos. Part of the Likutei Sichos became part of the Likutei Sichos. So as soon as Rabbi Jacobson came here, right away, he said to me, this is not the place I spoke. Good memory, Rabbi Jacobson. As I said, he figured that out right up. I said, not true. This is the place. This is the address. This is where you spoke in a different, this is the location. It was a different building, a different context, but it was the same location. I remember then, I quote some of the things that you said then. I still quote them to this day. This is my only knowledge that I have of reincarnation from Gilgulim, is what I got from you that evening. So I look forward again tonight to hearing things that I've never heard, and I'll be able to quote you for the next 25 years once again. It was better before. It was better before.
We're getting some feedback from someone.
No, you can't. Okay. Now it's worse.
They were saying it's up and
She said that it was, I have a picture that it should be moved further back, so
Okay.
just kind of.
Okay, you got to stand all the way back. I see. Without any further ado, I want to introduce Karen Koflik, who will introduce our speaker, Rabbi Jacobson.
Okay. So Rabbi Simon Jacobson is a dynamic speaker, educator, mentor to thousands here and around the world. He's dean and founder of the Meaningful Life Center, publisher of the Algemeiner Journal, and author of the best-selling book, Toward a Meaningful Life, which has sold over 400,000 copies. And LaTanya says it's one of the best books she's ever read. And so you have some person right here to back that up, and been translated into 13 languages. Rabbi Jacobson is a leading biblical and spiritual scholar, applying thousands of years of history and Torah wisdom to the challenges we face today. With his keen insight into the human condition, he has the unique ability to offer clarity, direction, and support to people of all backgrounds. In addition to all of his titles, accomplishments, and accolades, what strikes me the most about Rabbi Jacobson, and I've had the honor to meet with him one-on-one during COVID, is his humility and his genuine concern for each human being's potential and true essence. I'm grateful for my dear friend and chavruta Jilly Cooper, who introduced me to the rabbi many, many years ago. And I have been using my 60-day spiritual guide to the high holidays for many, many years. It gets me through the holidays. And I just wanted to say, it's no coincidence that yesterday was day 60. So like, here we are. We booked this months ago. I had no idea how it would fall out, but the holidays are over. So now what? Welcome, Rabbi Jacobson.
Technology catching up to the human race. Okay, thank you for all. Rabbi, is the rabbi? Oh, there we are. And Karen. And thank you, Ronnie, for helping organize Mitch. And the few that I've met now, or I would say re-met. This is talk about reincarnation. I feel like I'm in a reincarnation here 25 years later. Same body, maybe a new spirit. So thank you for having me. It's a real honor and pleasure. I hope I'll be here before next 25 years. And this place will be double or triple size in growth. So there's a lot of things to talk about, but I just, on a personal, emotional note, being that I just met some of you right before we began signing some books, it just brings back many memories. And it just reminds me of the divine providence, the hashgacha of life, the mysterious journey that we're all on, the twists and turns and ups and downs. And as Kierkegaard wrote, that you can only understand your life backwards, but we have to live our lives frontwards. But when you look back, you sometimes can connect the dots and see different, some people call serendipity, we call it hashgacha pratis, certain coordinates, and they come together. And I remember Hillary well back then regarding reincarnation. And a few of you reminded me, Rockland County, the article, the review that was written so many decades ago. There's almost nothing more powerful in life than when you see eternity, when you see things that are not temporary, because so much of our lives is impermanent. The food we eat, the money we make, our looks, as much as we don't like to believe it, but we do age with all the tricks of the trade. And this material world, that's what materialism is about. Matter is subject to change and is subject to the changes of time and space and the changes of age and erosion and deterioration and ultimately death. But on the other side of the coin, there are things that are eternal relationships. Even some of our loved ones who may have passed on, we remember them. And we don't just remember them as a distant memory, we remember them because we're like their living legacy. So whenever you are touched by eternity in this temporary world, I find it to be always miraculous because it means that the things we do in our lives do not die. Even though some of the physical things will not be here in a certain amount of years, or they have passed on from the past, but especially as the Jewish people can testify, we are what we call Am Yisrael Chai. There is an eternity. And I think it's important to remember that. You know, we live today relatively, I know everybody's got their, what they say in Yiddish, pekel. Everyone's got their challenges. But if you compare it to 80 years ago, where would most of us be if we were in Europe 80 years ago? We would have been rounded up, and I don't want to even spell out what would have happened. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. There's no one here that if you go back enough generations, and not many, you don't have to go back very far, and your story is a miracle. You are a walking miracle. The only thing is we take it for granted. The Baal Shem Tov, the great Hasidic master, put it this way. He said the difference between a miracle and a natural event is only frequency. Frequency. If the sun were to rise once in our lifetimes, everyone would say, what a miracle. But since it rises every morning, oh, okay, you know what? It's going to happen again tomorrow. In other words, it's really us. We need that novelty, that new rush of excitement. But if you really think about it, life is a bunch of miracles just happening in a consistent pattern. And how many of us are even aware that a healthy person breathes, exhales and inhales 18 times a minute, or a little less for those of us that need help? But who thinks about it? When the Police wrote the song, Every Breath We Take, it's actually a ripoff, plagiarism, straight from Medrash Tehillim. It comes from the book of Psalms, where King David concludes the entire book, where he says, every soul praises God. And the Medrash, the commentary explains there, because neshama in Hebrew is the same words as the same letters as the word breath. So it says, every breath you take, you should praise God, because every breath is a miracle. Just because it keeps happening, when you go to a hospital, God forbid, and you see someone has to struggle on a respirator, and no one should ever know that, you suddenly realize, 1 second, what are the processes for a healthy person to breathe? Start thinking about it. But who thinks about it? How much of our lives do we take for granted? So the downside, if I can call it that, of prosperity and success and freedom, like we have right now, we can sit here and talk all night about whatever we wish. We can study Torah, do mitzvahs, send our children to Jewish schools, practice religion as we see fit. No one's here waiting outside, taking our names, arresting us, or rounding us up. But we take it for granted. And the blessings of prosperity always come with the other side of it, and that is apathy and complacency and indifference. That's how it is, because we take it for granted. It's not a critique. I'm not here to criticize. This is human nature. You need to be reminded. You need to say every morning, Moda'ani, thank you for returning my soul to me. You need to say, thank you for giving me another breath. Yes, it is a blessing every moment. But that's what happens. Apathy. I can never resist this joke, even though I've said it hundreds of times. The guy asked his friend, what's worse, apathy or ignorance? And he said, I don't know, and I don't care. You know that one, right? It's always good to remember, because apathy is like that kiss of death. So that's why, even though this was not part of I didn't really prepare remarks, to be honest. I usually speak from my heart and I just try to draw upon that which I've learned in my life. But nevertheless, after meeting some of you and just hearing the trajectory of our lives, and here we intersect again, it just comes to me the miracle of our, let's call it the cross-pollination of souls, if you wish. Well, the way I like to always put it is that we're all indispensable musical notes in a large cosmic symphony, and we're here to play music together. So I'm going to try to do that a little tonight. Let's play some music together, not just mine, but yours. So even though, yes, it's true, I'm doing the speaking, you're doing the listening, but I can tell you that real speaking is listening, and real listening is speaking. And I'll just mention this, maybe I'll speak about it some more, because it intrigues everybody. How is it possible to remember 6 hours of the Rebbe's talks, almost verbatim, on Shabbat, on Shabbos and holidays, as the rabbi said, and then put it down and commit it to paper? So there is definitely a gift, but there are tricks to the trade. I'll teach you some tricks as well, hopefully, in this evening. And as much as time you allow me, listen, I don't want to overstay my welcome, but I will try to share as much as I can share. But I believe also sharing is, even though, as I said, I'm speaking, but speaking is listening, because I don't feel I'm speaking my ideas. I'm trying to channel that which what I was taught. You try to get yourself out of the way and just bring to the table or to the room, picking up the vibes and being able to communicate higher truths. Like I write my introduction to Torah Meaningful Life, the greatest compliment, to me at least, is when someone tells me, I read your book and I read nothing new. I always knew those truths. It means it's resonating. So I see that as a compliment, because truth doesn't belong to any one individual. Truth is something that's inside all of us. And unfortunately, sometimes it gets trapped. Quoting Michelangelo, they asked him, how do you sculpt those beautiful angels in the marble? And his response was, I see the angels trapped in the marble, and I carved and set them free. So the beauty is there, the angel is there, the music is in you. But sometimes our lives get trapped in marble, in concrete, sometimes other substances. You can fill in the blanks. And our job is, you want to say something? And sometimes, and our job is to so-called wipe off the dust and try to uncover. And discover the deeper truths. So when you hear someone say something and it resonates, like music, it resonates, that's the deepest compliment, because it's not like someone giving you something new. They're helping you access that which was always there. As a matter of fact, the Talmud tells us that every child in his mother's womb is taught the entire Torah. And then we're made to forget on a conscious level, but not unconscious level. So within our unconscious or superconscious is the term I would prefer. Not to disagree with Freud, but that's the term that's used more in Kabbalah and Hasidic literature, is to uncover that deeper superconscious voice within us all. So, being that we're also titled this post-holidays, now what, right? After the holidays, so we have to also be truth in advertising. So I will, even though some speakers feel they don't have to live up to the title, but at least you have to acknowledge that you are or you aren't. So I'm acknowledging that I'm going to try to, and I think we can connect it all. So where do we begin? I think I've begun already, but where do we go from here? Let me share this story. It's an anecdote, but it's a good one that captures, I think, the story of all our lives. And that's little Lucy is going to school, and she's studying biology, the origin of our species. And anyone who studied that knows it's quite confusing, especially the different scientific theories. She comes home, she asks her mother, where do we come from? Where are our origins? Who are our ancestors? So her mother, with a beaming, warm smile, sits her down and says, I always was anticipating this beautiful day. Let me share with you our roots. And she says, we had a grandmother that came from a small town in Poland and a grandfather in a town in Czechoslovakia. You go back a few generations back, a great-great-grandfather who wrote a very important work in Jewish law. And the farther back we go, the better it gets. All the way to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah in the Bible, all the way back to Adam and Eve, we just read about in the beginning of Genesis and Bereshit. Okay, beautiful. I mean, how many people have such a yichus, pedigree? Anyway, her father comes home. So Lucy goes to her father and says to him, asks the same question. Where do we originate from? And he, in stark contrast, his face falls all crestfallen. He gets all disturbed. And he says, I've always rued this day. Sit down, embrace yourself. And he begins to tell her, well, as far as we know, we go back a few million years, we originate from apes, primates. Before that, we originate from amphibians, from the sea. But prior to that, go back to bacteria, and something like 14, 15 billion years ago, what they estimate, a ball of gas. Okay, very different answer, right, that her mother gave. So Lucy is very confused, so she runs back to her mother and says, I don't understand. I asked you the question, you gave me one answer. Dad gave me a very different answer. Which one is it? And her mother smiles very calmly and says, we both told you the truth. Your father told you about his side of the family, and I told you about my side of the family. That's what he said. So there you have it. The reconciliation, maybe you heard it here first, between science and evolution and creationism, religion and faith and modernity. The truth is, beyond the joke, there is truth to it, because we do have two voices within us. We have two drives within us. You know, one, let's call it, we'll use the Freudian, Darwinian, social Darwinian interpretation of the ID, which is that the driving force, even though Freud today may not be the most popular father of psychology as he once was, but he's still the guy to disagree with. So there are many detractors and many different opinions. But the idea that the human being is driven by pleasure principle, by sexuality is our essential selfish nature, pure selfishness. But we also have an ego and a superego that has evolved in order for us to coexist, and we shouldn't kill each other. So we've developed tools and instruments and rationale to be able to red lights and green lights, to monitor and be able to cooperate with each other. Even though at heart, push comes to shove, most people will behave in a very selfish manner, and proofs are given for this. Look at an avalanche, look when people are tortured, they'll turn in even their closest relatives and friends. People turn to cannibalism. I mean, I don't want to go into all the gory details, but what human beings will stoop to if they are pushed and they're forced to have to make a choice between their own welfare or another. Another joke, a more subtle joke that comes to mind, these two guys go camping. Am I sounding like incoherent?
Just in case.
Just alcohol or water? Huh?
Straight up.
Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you. I'll make a blessing on this. L'chaim. Okay, thank you. So two guys go camping, and middle of the night, one guy wakes up and he hears rustling about, and he tells us, and he wakes up his friend. He says, "We got to get out of here. There's a bear right out the tent." And while he's telling him, he's tying his shoelaces of his sneakers. So the friend says to him, "Why you think you can outrun the bear?" He says, "No, all I have to do is outrun you." So this is the dog eats dog, survival of the fittest attitude, which many, whether we know it or not, this is in many ways the prevalent approach of many thinkers and many of us, whether we, again, know it or not. In school, this is what we're taught. That's one approach. There's a very different approach, and that is that we're not animals at heart and soul, but as we just read in the Bible, in Genesis, the first description of the human being is that we're created in the image of God. That means we're essentially spiritual human beings, transcendent human beings, and then we enter into a body. This was one of the things I spoke about back then, 25 years ago. You remember? Yeah. And we then enter into a body. Like some say, we're spiritual beings on a physical journey, not physical beings on a spiritual journey. And that's who we are. The Torah doesn't even describe and say we're intelligent or emotional creatures. That comes afterwards. The most important thing is we're a piece of God. However you define God, I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So it's a very stark difference. Sometimes you can say it's the difference between the id and the yid, if you wish. So Freud got it half right. And it would have been interesting to meet his mother and his early influences. But what did he get right? That he understood that there are inner forces at work that shape and drive our lives and our attitudes and our behavior. But he didn't dig deep enough. There's another thing called the pintele, the spark, that yes, there is a selfish part of all of us. We all know that. And that's why you see, unfortunately, people can't stoop to that level. But there's something deeper. Going back to Michelangelo's, there's something, an angel within us, a divine soul. So fundamentally, we're really good people, noble people, selfless people, transcendent human beings that are not driven just for our own survival, but that soul is placed into a body that is driven by selfish survival. So there you have, the father and the mother are both right. Depends what side of the family. The rest is up to us. We can choose. Which one will you choose? And I would say, not to be overly simplistic, that every choice we make in life is driven by this question. Every moment someone invites you and says, come, let's volunteer and go help some needy people, you have a choice. Am I going to take care of myself right now, or am I going to go do something that may be not so comfortable, but it's going to help another? Every 24/7, we make these choices. And it's a very powerful way to look at our lives, because very often you need to have context. Because the fact of the matter is, most of us are already on a 90 mile an hour, if not faster, roller coaster. You wake up tomorrow morning or tonight, responsibilities, expectations, maybe from your job, from your family, from real things, from imagined things. Everybody thinks that they have their necessities. I remember when COVID became COVID, March 2020. You all know, Purim time. Everyone remembers that. And one of the things that stood out to me immediately was suddenly everybody's comfort zones were disrupted. The security blankets that we always relied on, suddenly travel plans, school, jobs, everything. There was an area in life that was not impacted. And suddenly the things we thought were necessary, we suddenly realized, 1 second, I can live without a baseball game, or I can live without traveling, or I don't have to go to a restaurant every second night. Now, I'm not saying that was that per se is a blessing, but it's taught us that the things we think are controlling our lives are not necessarily controlling our lives. So for some people, it actually created a lot of crisis, internal crisis. People who are so dependent on these routines, very hard to suddenly, what do you do? For others, it actually was a tremendous spiritual awakening, because now you're forced to turn inward. I remember I gave a Zoom talk, and it was to a group of, it was actually a large group of over 1,000 students. across the country. There was someone from the Board of Education that knew me and said a bunch of young kids were not going to school. And they were looking for ways to stimulate, inspire. And remember, a lot of people were afraid. That period of complete unknown and uncertainty, there were people dying. No one knew what was going to get worse, whether it's going to get better. First, they said by July, it's all over. Then people realized not exactly that's the case. You know, you'll remember the uncertainty was even worse than the actual COVID in so many ways. So when I spoke to the students, so since on Zoom, you have the option to ask people to chat. So I had the host, moderator, I said, I'd like to ask a question and see what the young men and women have to say about this. What are the three most important priorities in your life right now? It was June 2020. And almost unanimously, I can't say everyone exactly, but more or less it was family, values, love, relationship, something like that. And I said, if I had asked that same question January 2020, what would you have answered? And again, almost everyone said the same thing. Sex, sports, video games, pleasure, or something like that. I don't remember exactly that. Money. That speaks for itself. Because as soon as those outer comfort zones are disrupted and disturbed, that what happens then is you start moving inward. As you move inward, you discover that there are other things that perhaps are more important. I talked before about eternity versus temporary. You know, what is it that we pursue in life? The fact of the matter is when you're comfortable, you will pursue instant gratification. And when you're uncomfortable, that's not enough. So you need to dig deeper. I mean, just to quote Warren Buffett, completely unrelated to this, but he said that until the tide is out, you don't know who's been swimming naked. Because when the tide is in, you know, you don't know who's who. But suddenly when the lights dim, you start seeing the cracks. So in that sense, I could say for my work, COVID, with all, I mean, I had people in my community and family and people who died. So I'm not in any way minimizing the tragedies that were involved. But overall, my work literally quadrupled since COVID because people were much more vulnerable and therefore more receptive. So it was a very interesting time, and it still remains in many ways. It's not quite the COVID, you know, we call it BC now. Before COVID, there's AC after COVID, but so it's not quite like it was. But there's still a certain sense of that vulnerability, and in the sense in the work that I do, that is where people are more open to the spiritual. So when we talk about these two choices we make in our lives, I think it's a very powerful way of describing how we make choices, and it will also connect very much to the holiday season and the post-holiday season, as I shall explain. But I want to go back for a moment to this word called God. You've all heard this word, right? More than once in your life. I have grappled with the word God myself. And, today full disclosure. So I'm called by some people the rabbi of atheists. I don't know if you know this. Yeah, because atheists seem to identify with me. Why? Because I understand their position and I'm not afraid of someone calling themselves an atheist. Because there are many arguments to be made for and against God in this world. I know you didn't invite me to make the case against God, but I need to talk about it because I think it's a very important subject that is not usually spoken about, definitely not by people that look like me, you know. So I think to preface, it'd be good to know part of my own history. So yes, I was born and bred in Crown Heights, USA. My parents are Russian born, and they came to the United States after World War II. They met and married in the mid-50s, 1955. I was born in 1956. You want to take a second to calculate my age? Please do. Go ahead. And so I'm a baby boomer. And my father was a journalist. I say was because now in heaven, I don't think there's journalism or media up there. It's a world of truth. They don't need media to interpret things, you know. But my mother, thank God, is alive, and may she be well many years. But I grew up in an interesting home. On one hand, it was a very religious environment. Went to Chabad schools, grew up very observant, and all the demands of going to school 7 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. And that doesn't mean we didn't have fun. And I wasn't particularly a great student, to be honest. I was more of the rebellious side of things. But that's the intensity I grew up around. On the other hand, because my father especially, and my mother as well, very well-read and open-minded people. So I have no dogma in my life, no dogma at all. I know that's a strange mix because usually religion comes with some dogma, and no judgmentalism, no dogma. And I know this because I had friends who came from very dogmatic homes, but I was not exposed to that. So I had this interesting mix. On one hand, very intense Jewish education and standards and values, but also not mixed with most of those stereotypes that any Woody Allen movie captures. Words like neurosis or guilt or punitiveness or judgmentalism, condescension. I can give you the whole list. So it actually was, for me personally, an extremely powerful experience, because I don't know what I would have done if there was dogma around me and I was being imposed upon. Because I'm by nature much more of a free spirit, more of a creative type. And I don't think I would have lasted in such an environment. So this served me well. Now, I would say in my teens, I was more like, today I use the words, then I didn't have the language. I would probably say I was a rebel without a cause. I had a lot of rebellious and very powerful energy, which I didn't know how to harness or where to direct. So though I grew up, as I said, in a very religious environment, and I must tell you also, full disclosure, I wasn't abused, I wasn't molested. So I have no anger. I was not bitter. So I don't have any of that. It was much more for me an intellectual and spiritual journey of trying to find what is real in this world. So I saw a lot of good people in my life, beautiful Jews, beautiful rabbis, beautiful teachers, and very kind people. But I also saw a lot of hypocrisy, and I saw a lot of mediocrity, which was even worse for me, to be honest, and a lot of things that didn't excite me. I wasn't inspired. And I'm just being very straight and honest. What changed, and it's not an overnight story, it didn't change overnight. What changed was when I began to be exposed to the spirituality of Judaism, namely Hasidic thought. You can call it the mystical, the esoteric. And that's when it rang true to me like music. Literally, it's like when you hear a song, you can't deny that it touches you, So though I had my measure of skepticism, and I still have it, but a song is a song, something touches you. And then those truths started resonating with me. And I realized that Judaism was not just a body of laws and didactic do's and don'ts. That's the mechanics of it. But it was far more a spiritual system that helps you actualize your soul in this world, helps you find yourself. And that Abraham, almost 4,000 years ago, understood that. And that's what he pioneered. And as opposed to what most people think, Judaism is really is a nonconformist system. Most people will associate religion with conformity, even if it's a good conformity. You have to belong to a community, don't stand out, whatever it may be. I realized that it was actually the exact opposite. It was the most rebellious and revolutionary. It was about changing this world. The world is a materialistic world, and Judaism teaches a universal message for Jews and non-Jews, a universal message that we're here to transform a material world into a spiritual oasis, into a spiritual garden. To put it in a nutshell. This inspired me. This touched me very deeply. And that's when I went and revisited. And I said, you know what? A lot of the religious stereotypes or imagery or myths are exactly that. They're myths. Now remember, not every stereotype is false. A stereotype has a reason why it's a stereotype. Enough people do it, it becomes a stereotype. Just like the guy that said, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean no one wants to get me. So just because it's a stereotype doesn't mean it isn't true. And I realized that pretty early on, and I really thank God for, if I could say thank God, for that awareness. It was a certain, I think by grace, and it was very valuable to me because it helped me understand a few things that really shaped who I am today. And even as I stand here, so I'm still that 17-year-old, I would just say with 48 years of experience. Is it 48 and 17? Yeah, something like that, right? And when I began teaching the class that some of you attended 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I really began this class in 1982. So we're talking now 40 years when I began to teach. But I may say teach, remember I mentioned before, my life was all surrounded in basically behind academic walls. My job was to remember and write and publish Lubavitcher Rebbe's talks, which was high-level scholarship, required a lot of research, a lot of work on that level. But I always knew that I was also blessed with the ability to communicate it to audiences that did not grow up in that environment. And that was a real important thing because that's like a bridge. So when I ultimately wrote Toward a Meaningful Life, that was my goal, was to try to bridge these two worlds that really didn't speak to each other that much. Very much, you go to Torah scholars, real Torah scholars, they can't speak the language of the modern world. And the people that speak the language of the modern world are not Torah scholars. That's unfortunate reality. It's not a critique, again, it's just the way it is. So to be able to bridge the two is a critical thing, and that really is what drives me. That's like my mission, so to speak. So with that, I want to go back to the word God, because I think it's critical in understanding ourselves. So maybe a good story to begin. I want to share two maybe as many stories that come to mind, at least, that capture this, that I think are very valuable. And that was one I was, when Toward a Meaningful Life was published by William Morrow. So I, a greenhorn, didn't know what a publisher was altogether. They told me, now you have to go out on a book tour. Those days there was a book tour. We're talking now 1995, 96. And they set up a whole thing. I was treated like a celebrity, prima donna, red carpet, the whole works. Could just tell you it's like Cinderella. You turn into a pumpkin at midnight. So don't take it too seriously, you know. And that's what I did. They sent me to 20 cities. First, it started the major cities like New York and Philadelphia, and, I remember Detroit, Los Angeles, Miami. But because they were successful events, and Barnes and Nobles and Borders was also a chain at the time, and some independent bookstores. So it ended up being 90 cities in those 2 years. So I really traveled extensively, and I had unbelievable stories because I was going to a bookstore. I wasn't going to a synagogue or to Young Israel or to Chabad House or to a Jewish JCC. So I was in an environment where you meet people who may not even be coming to listen to you. They may be coming to get a coffee or to buy a water repair manual, for all you know. So it created this interesting interactions. So here I was in Cleveland, and the way they lined up, it was pre-internet, essentially. Internet really just began in 1994, 95. For those of you old enough to remember, you all look young to me, so you probably don't remember. That's a compliment, okay? Okay. So 95, 96, and I remember, so they lined up like print, radio, and TV interviews. That's what the media was then. So in the morning, you go to these morning drive shows. So like new authors that are featured, you have like a 6 or 7 minute interview on a couch in a studio. So I come, I think it was CBS or Good Morning America, I don't remember which one, in Cleveland. It's a live, and as I walk in, so they introduced me to the anchor person who's going to interview me. So she comes out. As soon as she sees me, I see her face change, and she looks very disturbed in a way. I had no idea why. I thought maybe it was something on my face. I don't know. Anyway, I say, "Are you all right?" She says, "Yeah, but you know, I read your book. I love your book. I never expected the author to look like you, because she had never seen me. No internet then, right?" So she said, so I said, what do you expect? So she said, "I actually have your book on my night table." That's what she said. I expected, this is the words that she used. I have to share it exactly the way she said it. She said, "I expected a 6'2", sexy looking, skinny, clean shaven guy." So I said to her, "I thought I was all of that. Except maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions. I can't say I'm clean shaven, but you know." Anyway, we had our laugh. So, you know, talk about stereotypes. So I said to her, "Why don't you talk about that on TV? That's a great question. Why don't you ask me that?" She says, "I can't say it that way. It's a little insulting." So I said, "No, fine. Find a nice way to put it." Anyway, that's what she asked me. So we begin the interview. She says, "Here, I have Rabbi Simon Jacobson, author of Toward a Meaningful Life, a great book. I love this book." And, I don't even know if she was Jewish, to be honest. I never figured that out. But she says, and then she says, "So Rabbi Jacobson, tell me, this book is so universal. It talks about topics that we all struggle with and we all address. Wouldn't your message be well received better if you looked like one of us?" That's what she put it. That's how she put it. Okay, a little more respectful, which I frankly liked. I was not at all offended, to be very honest. So I said, "Yes, that's." I said, "Do you think you can get away with such a question if I was an Arab prince or someone from the islands dressed in their garb?" You know, and I said that half humorously. I said, "You know, you can say that to me, And I must tell you, I'm not offended, but let me ask you something. I'm not concerned with how you're dressed or how others are dressed. Why can't we just talk to each other soul to soul and not look at each other based on our externals, based on our clothing? I'm comfortable in my own skin. Hope you are. And maybe we can just, this is an opportunity that you can talk to me as a human being. Let's see if we can find common interests. And she knows, and she liked my response. She didn't see it as offensive. And that's what we did the next 6 minutes. That's what we talked about. But this was what I encountered many times, where people would look at me and they say, one second, it's not consistent with the message that you're sharing. And that was essentially, it's a stereotype. They're stereotyping. And then when they get to know me, they'll say, okay, you're an exception. Okay, you're different. Fine, I'm ready to forgive your beard and your yarmulke or whatever it may be. That's story number one. Story number two was when I began giving my class, and this was in 1982, I mentioned. So in the beginning, the first few years, it used to be in Brooklyn. Then in 1990, I moved to Manhattan. That's when I was in the 81st and West End, and then in the, what is it called? Manhattan Jewish, whatever it's called, day school, I don't remember. On 88th or something. Shiva Katana, yeah, okay. But before that, I was doing it in my office, actually, in Brooklyn. The people that were coming to the class were mostly from the arts and entertainment industry. That's how it happened to be. People were many Jews, many non-Jews as well, but people, artists, musicians, singers, songwriters. Then they started bringing their lawyers and their accountants and so on, who weren't as interested as they were, because they were more, so very spiritual people, but not from any traditional source. Like if you ask them where they got their where they get their spirituality, it would be from Zen Buddhism, or if I, with Rabbi's permission, may say something that is not an acronym for Let's Start Davening. Okay, LSD. Or yeah, that was what they would share their psychedelic trips, and I would share my journeys, and it was a very interesting conversation. Now I realized that I was at a disadvantage because as a communicator, I was always very sensitive. That here I am sitting with a yarmulke and a beard. Yes, I look younger than I am today, but still, and I knew it wasn't a neutral, I wasn't projecting a neutral image. And I didn't know what they were thinking. Not that I was self-conscious, but I wanted to be able to make sure we're communicating. For all I know, I may remind one person of an angry grandfather that schlepped him to synagogue, him or her to synagogue on Yom Kippur against their will. Or I may remind someone of a irrelevant Hebrew school teacher, that taught hollow lessons. And that was like the end of their Judaism. Or I may remind them of a good memory of a Passover Seder with their grandfather as well. I didn't know, so I tried an experiment. This is the experiment. I decided I'm not going to use any religious language, nothing from the Bible, nothing from the Torah, nothing from Judaism. I'm going to create my own language here. So instead of the word God, I use the word a higher reality or the essence. Or if it was a particular new age group, I would use words like undefined layers of indeterministic energy or something like that. If it was instead of Torah, I use the word blueprint or roadmap, spiritual roadmap. Instead of mitzvahs, I use the word connections. And instead of Mashiach and Geula, I use the word destination. And here I was pontificating, waxing eloquent about this journey into the essence of all of reality, reaching this indeterministic energy state, and following a blueprint that helps us make connections between the inner and the outer, and with the ultimate goal is to reach the destination of total fusion between spirit and matter, between indeterminism and determinism, between body and soul, between soul and body, I said, between form and function, and then in a seamless flow where you have this grand cosmic symphony of all human beings finding harmony within diversity. That was that. That was the gist of it. And I went on for hours. And I just changed the language. And I have to tell you, the people, they were like mesmerized. They loved it. Week after week. And then more people came. And one day, one evening before the class, a guy came over to me. His name was Kenny Vance. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Jay and the Americans. Jay Black recently was Olav Shalom, passed away. He actually learned cantorial lessons from Kasavitsky. So some of his songs have a certain cantorial sound. So Kenny Vance was one of the people in the band. He was one of the Americans, Jay and the American. He comes over to me. He was very tall. He looked Italian. And he says to me, these classes have been unbelievable, but I want to know, are you talking about God? So I said, yes, but don't spoil it for the others. That was the story. And it was, I think back about it, and till this day, it was excellent. It was better than I expected, the experiment. And I realized, I obviously finally told them what I'm talking about, and everyone laughed, but mission accomplished. Because had I used the word God and Torah and mitzvahs and Mashiach, forget about whether, I'm not even getting into whether people have negative impressions. Just those words are already alienating. What does that mean? Everyone uses the word God. I believe in God. I don't believe in God. I know but one of my favorite stories, I use it in Torah Meaningful Life on the chapter on God, when Rabbi Lev Yitzchak Barditchev was once told a self-proclaimed atheist. He said, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. Think about that. So what does the word God mean? God, most of us, knee-jerk reaction to God is what we usually picked up in nursery school or from parents, or they're not necessarily sources that are very sophisticated. Which course did you take on God that gave you a real comprehensive picture of different interpretations? And this is something that I discovered, because when I grew up, the word God was used all the time. And I came to realize it's a word that's used and everyone means something else, or that doesn't mean anything for that matter. I had to really find a way, what does it mean to me? What does it mean? What does God really mean? So if someone, for example, says God is a guy that sits on a throne with a long white beard, ready to strike us with lightning when we misbehave, I would say I'm an atheist if that's the definition of God. So before we argue, let's first define the words. Any contract, the first thing a lawyer does is define terms. Then we could say we agreed to these terms, we don't agree. But if someone were to say that maybe a very simple interpretation, that God is simply the fact that you're accountable to some higher force than yourself. It's not just about you. Instead of worshiping yourself, you're worshiping something greater than yourself. Most people would say, oh, that's interesting. A God like that, I don't have a problem with. Actually, many of us would have a problem, because the fact is everybody worships something. It's either yourself and your needs or something greater than yourself. But then you have a conversation that makes a lot more sense. The problem is that the fact is God has been definitely hijacked and misrepresented. There's a reason science rejected religion. I'm not saying it didn't go too far. It went too far, but there's a reason, because the God that was, when Nietzsche wrote that God is dead, and of course the comedians like to remind us, Nietzsche said God is dead and God said Nietzsche is dead, so there's who has the last word. But the point is, when Nietzsche wrote God is dead, he was saying the God that I grew up with, he was referring to the Christian God, was never alive in the first place. He wasn't killing God. He was saying, once I found out that that's God, that's not a real God. So you have to really define God before you start killing God, or before and that I think is the biggest challenge. Because once you're getting into the picture, I met Woody Allen, by the way. He was a friend of some of the people that came to my class. And he was so skeptical and cynical, I really couldn't say anything to him, to be honest. He said to me, whatever you say, I've already heard. Yes, you're a smart guy, so you know how to package it right. I understand the God I grew up with is not the real God. But it's just too many Jews are believing in the wrong God. And that's what I reject. That was the way he ultimately silenced me. I also, not to drop names, I also met Leonard Cohen, who is a very good man, a very good soul, also through my classes. And he actually is the exact opposite. He said, sadly, I didn't really study Judaism, but I wish I had. And in the later years of his life, we used to communicate in writing and then also in person a few times. But my point is, all these great minds and these geniuses, many of them became cynics and skeptics. What they rejected really was the way God was presented. As smart people, they would not say I rejected God. The way God was presented, it's a very different thing, just as the way Judaism is presented. The question is, can you access it? I mean, the classic, I won't talk about jokes. I was once invited to be, I know this is going to sound strange, but I was invited to Stand Up New York. It's a comedy club. So it was Christmas night. It's called Mittel Night. So it's a night where they did comedy. They invited some rabbis to do comedy. Someone thought I was a rabbi. I don't really like being called rabbi, but thought I was a rabbi, so they invited me. So what am I going to do in a comedy club? So I told some of my anti-religious jokes, so I got everybody's attention. Then I told some pro-religious jokes, and I was able to get a message across. So one classic joke that is always, two classic jokes that always get everybody's attention. Two guys get lost in a hot air balloon, and they're trying to figure out where they are. And then they see someone down below, and they say, "Hey, where are we?" And the guy yells up, "You're in a hot air balloon." Okay, a gust of wind comes and whisks them away. And one guy says to the next, "What was that?" He says, "That was definitely a rabbi." He says, "How do you know it was a rabbi?" He says, "Because what he said was true, but irrelevant." So whenever I say this, I wouldn't expect a great laugh because you're all here in a synagogue with a rabbi. So, but when I say this in the more, let's call it skeptical audiences, they don't stop laughing. Because they all, yeah, of course, that's, yeah. And especially it's coming from a guy that looks like a rabbi. How do you like that? That really, the second one is the classic Woody Allen one. Now I'm saying it not just to get a laugh from you. I'm saying it for a reason. This is the pulse of our times. Not maybe by you, all of you don't have to see this, but I can tell you, and I'm sure you have friends and so on. I can tell you people, I remember in Paramus, New Jersey, I went for a book signing toward a Meaningful Life, and a woman came with like 9 books, and she asked me to sign them. And then she said, "I'm going to have to tear off the covers of these books before I give them to my friends, because they won't read it because it says the Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson on the cover. And they just won't look at it. Once they read it, I'll give them the cover." So don't underestimate. And again, this may resonate with you. Maybe you know people like this. I've met many, many. So that's why I never take it for granted. And so the second story that I was going to share was that the guy comes to a rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I hear the Torah has the answer to all our secrets, to life secrets. Yes. Will you teach it to me?" "Sure." "How much will it cost?" He says, "How could I charge? God gave it for free. Moses gave it for free. How could I charge you for studying Torah?" So he's doubly impressed. He's going to get the secrets of life, and it's all for free. They sit down and they open up a Torah. It's in Hebrew. He doesn't know Hebrew. So the rabbi says Hebrew lessons will be $20,000. That resonates? Okay. Now, I hope, Rabbi, I mean everyone except you, by the way. I don't mean you at all. So please, I just want to make sure. There we go. Now I respect you. The point of all my stories is really that all of us have the 2 voices inside of us. And the reason I elaborated, because I wanted to come back with what is God? It has to be something very personal and intimate and relevant. And if you can't achieve that, it will remain an abstract idea at best. So here's another story I want to share. And this I will lead into the title of our talk. So I will address it. It's all connected. Trust me, I respect that title. It's an important title, but you'll see it all comes together. Any of you been to Santa Cruz, California? Okay, you've been? Yeah. Santa Cruz is an hour south of San Francisco. So one of the cities I visited, and a small little quaint town situated between the Pacific and mountains. Beautiful climate, really beautiful town, very soulful. And I could see there's a lot of Jews there, a lot of seekers go there. So at the evening, I had a talk in a bookstore called Gateways. Nothing to do with the Jewish Gateways. This was a New Age bookstore on, is it Main Street or Central Avenue? One of those 2 names. And there were 250, 300 people there. It was a very comfortable environment. It was a carpet. I remember a lot of people sitting on the floor. It was very warm. I didn't feel the need to go through a rigorous mind games of proving God's existence. I felt everybody was already in a place of soulfulness. So it was in many ways very comfortable. So after my talk, questions. A woman stands up and she says, "I grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn." You all know where that is? It's quite a religious community, Borough Park, Brooklyn. And I went to Beis Yaakov schools, very religious school. My parents were Holocaust survivors. I'm one of, I think she said 9 children, or 11 children, 9 children, I think. And the horrible childhood I had. I was always very inquisitive and curious, asked a lot of questions, but my community did not respect that. They actually would always try to beat me up for my questions. My parents were angry people. My mother was angry. My father was even angrier. And it was always told me, be quiet, be still. She spoke Yiddish, I could tell. Be quiet, be good Yiddish Mädele like your mother and grandmother. Stop bothering, stop disrupting. She said, but my soul was seeking. And then she used these words. I felt my soul was asphyxiated. Asphyxiated, that was the word she used. And I could not breathe. So finally at age 17, I built up the courage. I packed my bags one night and I left early morning, never to return. I'm sure my parents sat shiva for me, but I moved to California. And by the way she described it, it sounded like late 60s. She ended up at Sunset Strip in LA, then Haight-Ashbury scene in San Francisco. And finally, I ended up here in Santa Cruz. And I found my God, not in Judaism. With all respect, I found it, she said exactly those same words that I had heard in Zen Buddhism and in acid. That's where I found God. And I'm at peace. I never look back. I don't want to see my parents. I just cut out that part of my life. And I'm very comfortable here. You're the first person that I've seen as a rabbi in almost 20 years when I left. And I want to know, you're talking about God and spiritual. I think I even told the story about God in the language, not using that word. She said, you talk about it so comfortably. Where did you get all of this? I never learned this in Beis Yaakov, none of the Jewish schools in my home. Where does this come from? And I saw in the face of others that they had a similar question. So I said to her, well, we Jews have this thing called the 613-step program. So she laughed. She said, okay, I understand. So after the crowd dispersed, she stayed around with another maybe 8, 9 people. And we had this long marathon conversation deep into the night. The store closed, I think, at 1 a.m. And then we went outside. It was a beautiful night, sat on a park bench. The 8 of us, 9 of us. And we just talked about everything, life, purpose, good and evil, soul, Holocaust. Is there a God? Is there no God? All, the things when you're in college and you have all night to spend, no day job. And that's what we did. I said to her the following. I said to her, look, I'm not here to judge you. I don't know what I would have done if my soul was asphyxiated. So I'm not here to tell you you did right, you did wrong. But I will tell you this, that they only taught you half of Judaism. They only taught you the mechanics, the body. They never taught you the other side. And I shared with her an anecdote that I had heard. I don't even know where it comes from. If any of you know where this parable comes from, I'd love. Sometimes I think I made it up, but I don't think I made it up. I think I read it somewhere. That when God created the universe, he created the nightingale. The nightingale is a bird with a beautiful voice. And the bird comes to God and says, thank you for giving me a beautiful voice, but there's a problem. I may be one night, one dusk, perched on a branch, serenading into the night, and everyone loves my songs and melodies, but there's a predator who's hungry for dinner. And who will they be attracted to? To this piece of meat on the branch, me. So God, please give me something to protect myself from my enemies. So God offered the bird a beak. A beak is like a razor sharp nose. The bird inspected the merchandise and says, no, for an elegant bird like me, a nose like that, no. Okay. So then God says to the bird, okay, what about a set of claws? Again, the claws are these sharp razor-like fingernails, not becoming. So finally, God says to the bird, okay, I'm going to give you a set of wings. In Hebrew, they call it knafayim, wings. The bird looks at the wings, never saw wings before, and says, I don't understand. You're the master of the universe. You created the world with such elegant design. I have enough body weight to carry with me. You're giving me 2 extra pieces of dead weight. It'll make it harder, more difficult for me to escape from predators. So God, of course, said to the bird, no, little bird. These are called wings. And when you learn to use them, you can fly and soar, and you can escape anyone that pursues you. So I said to this woman and to the others there, I said, look, Torah, mitzvahs, Judaism on face value is more burden. It's more weight. There's 613 mitzvahs. Okay, many of them we can't do today, but many we are obligated to do. And many don't do this, don't do that. And if you look at it purely from a perspective of laws, do's and don'ts, it's a lot of body weight. Who needs body weight? However, there are also wings. So there's no bird on earth, even a bird on a diet. And by the way, birds don't go on diets, only humans do. There's no bird on earth that would say, don't give me wings because I'll weigh a little extra, because the wings will actually also help you get to places you can never get to. So they taught you about the Torah mitzvahs, about the mechanics of the weight. That doesn't have any relevance. It's just don't do this, don't do that. Pesach comes, literally an OCD holiday, every drop of crumb, you got to search. I remember my grandmother, my mother. If it was just that, I would think it's like, okay, some people, maybe they like this type of obsession. But then you discover that it's also wings that helps your soul soar to places it can never reach. So it would be like someone offering you 100 pounds of stones. If you carry it from here to here, okay, it belongs to you. Who needs stones? But if I said 100 pounds of diamonds, you'd ask for 200 pounds. Now, 100 pounds of diamonds don't weigh less than 100 pounds of stones. The difference is you see the value. So it overshadows and outweighs the weight. What do you care about the weight? A little exertion, but you're getting such value. Let me tell you what happened. I shared the story. This woman from Beis Yaakov that left 20 plus years ago from Borough Park started crying like a little girl. And then others started crying, and I started crying too. So we had, yes, some men cry. We had this sobbing session, but it was healthy. It's what the Kabbalists call that the tears that bathe the soul. It was not tears of pain or loss or tragedy. It was pains, existential pains that you feel, deeper truths. Now, I did not play a trip on her and say, okay, I did tell her, by the way, at some point, because we maintained the connection. I said, if you really want to be a bold spiritual leader, you should move back to Borough Park and open a Chabad house or another house, whatever you want to call it, and maybe teach 17-year-old girls that which you weren't taught. So I couldn't convince her yet to do that, but we're on the way. So the point I'm making, however, is this changes the whole perspective when you look at Judaism this way. Because this brings me back to two main points I want to make. One is talk about the holidays and the post-holidays. And the second is I promised I would also share something about my years of remembering what the Rebbe said, okay? So I'm trying to deliver on both these things. Do I still have your patience and time? Where are we here? I don't know the curfew here in Harrison, so but back where I come from, they start making phone calls at. I didn't promise that I'm going to bring you to tears. That's, Ronnie, you just burst the bubble here. Now, no one's going to cry when you say that. That has to come like, when you get vulnerable. And so, to me, the holiday season is an ultimate paradox, because on one hand, most people expect Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchas Torah, like the most awesome days. That's what we're told. New Year, the holiest day of the year, days of joy. But let's be honest, when I was a young kid, when I was a teenager, I would always ask my father and other adults around me, I said, everyone talks about these high holidays. I was a little troublemaker. So I would ask, I say, did anyone actually change from before Rosh Hashanah till after Simchas Torah? I see the angry people, they're still angry. The selfish people are still selfish. The stingy people are still stingy. So good, it's a nice idea, nice concept. And I didn't mean it just to be contrarian. I was sincerely looking for an answer. So my father would always tell me the wise answer was, he would always say, you'll get older, you'll understand. So when I got older, I understood that he didn't understand, and no adults understand. So now you're join the club, fine. But to me, it always bothered me tremendously, because to me, it was like, okay, so why do we do this? We do it because it's tradition. That's what many will say. That's what we've been doing for thousands of years. Yeah, we don't really understand it all. You do it, that's what we do. You make a deal with God, it's a day of judgment, a little superstitious. Why? Because, you do this, God will do this for you. Hopefully it'll work out. The day when life and death is determined, who's going to die, who's going to live. So it always gets to our guilt and to our so-called conscience. Well, what about some of us who don't have such a conscience, or a little more cynical? So what do we do with that? So I'm not against tradition. I understand that people come around just like a Thanksgiving dinner. So there's a Rosh Hashanah dinner. Lahavdil. I'm not trying to sound irreverent, by the way. Honestly, I hope nobody takes it that way. I was just trying to be honest about it. To me, this is why I think I'm successful communicating with secular people, because they hear this, they say, oh, okay, at least you're addressing questions that I have. So I remember, what was it, around 20 years ago. So I was invited by my friend in Santa Monica, his name is Peter Himmelman. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He's a musician. Well, you definitely know his father-in-law. His father-in-law is Shabtai Zusha Zimmerman, otherwise known as Bob Dylan. You've heard of this man? Okay. I knew some names. Yeah. So he married Maria. Maria is the oldest child of Bob Dylan, in case you need that. Peter called me and said, Peter came also from Minnesota. I met him in New York in the 80s. He was one of those guys, very spiritual, but very non-traditional at all. He was, you ever see, what's the name of this movie, the Coen Brothers, The Serious Man? That cynical movie about Judaism? One of those films. Yeah. So he came from that world. Like, his joke was always, ham was kosher, bacon was glatt kosher. But when my grandmother heard I'm eating ribs on Sunday, that's trace. That's the world he grew up in. Rib, it's coming all from the same pork. But that was the world he grew up in. So Peter called me. At this point, he was already a Shomer Torah mitzvahs. It's a long story with Peter himself, but I don't want to go into that in detail. He says, I'd like to do a Yom Kippur service, and we'll title it Yom Kippur for the Unaffiliated. Would you come and do it together with me? And he was going to I rented out the theater on Wilshire and Montana. It's called, I forgot the name of the theater. It's like one of these old theaters. And he advertised it. And I said, okay, let's do it. Do hands-on. It'll be very interactive, make it very personal, spiritual. And he advertised it in some of the newspapers, magazines, Yom Kippur for the Unaffiliated. So lo and behold, none of us knew, but 1,700 people showed up. 1,700 people, yes, on Kol Nidre night. I guess it resonated with people, the unaffiliated. It sounded interesting, Basically, it said, if you don't have a place to go to and you're not interested in most places where you go, this is for you. So I guess some people tried, some people knew his name. The word got out. We were pretty surprised, but the theater had a capacity of 2,000, so it was pretty full. It was really life-changing. I can't speak for the audience, but for me, because I was forced to really have to explain it, because there were people who had no idea what Yom Kippur is. So it was very, very personal, very emotional. And I took nothing for granted. We had a chazan, we had a cantor who read the prayers, but almost every line I explained or we sang, and then right after Kol Nidre, which did like an hour, I think, service, then we had a question and answer period. Almost everyone stayed. So it was already after the service, we had like a discussion for around 2 hours. It was fascinating because people really got engaged. Then they came back the next day. Obviously, there were more times through the day there were less. Yisker and Ne'ilah and Kol Nidre, the largest audience, but the largest amount that people came. But even through the day, over 1,000 people. It was we did it 2 years in a row. Then we couldn't, for some reason, get that location. So now that event is what basically spawned the book 60 Days that you pointed out. I even write about it briefly. So a woman that was in the audience told me that she was a devout Buddhist, and she never went to Yom Kippur service in her life. She celebrated Yom Kippur, but with Buddhist meditations at home. And she said to me, is that what you find that to be? Because I like very much your service. Is there a place in New York or other places? So I didn't really have a place to send her to, but I felt so challenged by her. I said, what would you, if I gave some time and helped you interpret some Yom Kippur prayers in a way that speaks to you as good as the Buddhist meditations, would you be open to that? She said, sure. Would you do that? So that's what I did. I did research. Ultimately, that turned into a book called 60 Days. Why am I saying it? I mean, this woman, just to give you the end of the story, today she's what shall we say, a mother of 6 and Torah observant Jew, and lives in New York, a very fine person. And I'm not here to take credit. I'm just sharing what I shared with her, the deeper meaning of Yom Kippur that she had never heard before. So to me, the challenge when we say the holiday season, and then we come after the holiday season, is exactly this challenge I was describing earlier. How do we personalize it? Because if you can personalize the high holidays, then you can personalize what we do today as we leave the holiday season. If you can't personalize the high holidays, then the whole thing is just more or less pretty superficial and cosmetic. So the holidays, if I can really capture 3 key components of the spectrum of life. And that's in 3 words: renewal, sanctity, and joy. One of the things that many of us suffer from is feeling bored, to put quite bluntly. Monotony. Why do you think most people get into trouble? Because they feel bored. So they're looking for something to get them out of their existential loneliness or boredom. It could be something healthy, it could be something unhealthy. So the concept that Rosh Hashanah is the new year, renewal, that this is a year where a new energy enters into this world. I'm using the words of the Arizal, the great mystic, the Arizal, and the words of the Alter Rebbe and Tanya, that a new energy enters into the world, but more importantly, into you, to your soul, into your heart, into your psyche. Something that is unprecedented, and it's your job is to access it, is an unbelievable lesson, the idea of finding renewal in your life. I mean, look at marriages. Even great marriages suffer from a certain monotone. Okay, it's a routine. So maybe it's more comfortable than something that is negative, but it's still, the routine of it can become quite, because we are restless human beings. Where does the restlessness of a soul come from? From a very healthy place. Use the words of Proverbs, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the soul of a human being is the flame of God. Look at a flame, and you have the closest approximation to what your soul looks like. That's why flames play such a prominent role. Shabbos candles, Hanukkah candles, a Havli Yartzeit candle, flames, a menorah in the temple. A flame defies gravity. It flickers, it's restless, and it's always looking upward. That is the nature of a soul. It's transcendent and restless. And if you don't feed that restlessness, we ultimately are going to look for something and that may not be so healthy. So we have 2 choices. You either choose animal bliss, where we numb ourselves, either with physical medication or other ways. No, we numb ourselves psychologically in other ways, or that restlessness has to be fed by things that are not healthy. You know, I can't resist the joke. The guy is sitting on a bench, an older Jew, and he's all depressed. And someone comes over, his friend, and says, "Why are you so depressed?" He says, "My wife is very angry at me." What's news? She's always angry at me. He says, "No, today's something special." What happened? When she went to work this morning, she asked me, "What am I going to do today?" And I told her nothing. So she said, "1 second, you said that yesterday. You're going to do nothing." So I told her I wasn't finished. I wasn't finished doing nothing. Now, we live in a day and age today where some people think doing nothing is like an achievement. You know, I wish I could make enough money that I can do nothing. But nothing goes against the grain of the very existence of nature. Nature, the human being, there's nothing that does nothing. The seasons change. Right now, even inanimate objects have pulsating subatomic particles constantly moving. There's no such thing as nothing. It's only the human being that try to create this fantasy of a couch potato that I do nothing. And I'm fine, and I feel good about it. That would be the biggest achievement. If someone can come up with a pill that destroys guilt, I think that would be probably the best selling product ever. You know, you don't feel guilt. You can do nothing, not accomplish a thing and feel great. But it goes against the grain of human nature. So Rosh Hashanah comes and teaches us renewal. Yom Kippur is sanctity. That life is sacred. It's not just a mundane, meaningless, arbitrary experience. Everything is sacred. Every grain of sand is sacred. Every human being is sacred. Every life is sacred. And finally, Sukkot teaches us the concept of joy. So imagine if you were able to experience every day of your life renewal, sanctity, and joy, tell me what your life would look like. So I'm here to tell you that though Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot are over, the holidays are over, but the spirit of it is not over. This is a direct quote from some Hasidic discourses, Maimer, Maimar. And what does it say? That Rosh Hashanah renewal is transmitted to every day. You know, when we wake up in the morning is a mini Rosh Hashanah. So when we say Moda'ani, like I mentioned before, thank you for returning my soul to me. How did God create us? That we're not up 24/7. You go to sleep and you're supposed to wake up refreshed. It's a mini Rosh Hashanah. It's a mini new renewal every morning. But you need to be cognizant of it. You need to do something about it. The second thing, sanctity of Yom Kippur. Yes, there's only one Yom Kippur in the year. That's the day, that sanctity, the day, to put it in different words, a day, the birth of hope and forgiveness that Moses was granted after the Jews had built the golden calf. So that's another sacred thing. They say forgiveness is divine. So every day we have moments of sanctity, if you wish. Sacred moments during prayer, during study, during a mitzvah. Obviously, every Shabbos is a mini Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is called the double Shabbos of Shabboses. And finally, joy. Joy is not just 7, 8, 9 days of Sukkot and Simchas Torah. Joy is Ivdus Hashem b'simcha, to serve God with joy. You know what joy is? Joy is not an act, it's a state of being. If you are naturally connected to your soul and you know you're a soul that's traveling through a body and not a body that's experiencing spirituality, you would always be joyous. You ever see children, you know any children that were born sad? Except those exceptions, unfortunately, due to certain circumstances. Why do they have natural joy? Because they're naturally not self-conscious. They don't feel, they're exuberant. They have a free abandon about them. Your soul is always joyous. The problem is, like with the Michelangelo analogy again, we don't access it. So we get into a state of depression or a state of sadness or melancholy. That's not our natural state. So the fact of the matter is that the holidays don't really end. They only end in the sense of the energy that they exude. So it's like resources that we gather. And now there comes the time, and this is an actual expression, is we unpack these resources throughout the year. That's when you can achieve the antidote to post-holiday blues. You know, everybody has that after the hangover, after the honeymoon. You know, the answer to that is that the honeymoon is not over. You have to find ways to achieve that renewal, that sanctity, and that joy every day. So this sounds a little abstract. So I'm going to give you a practical suggestion, something that we all do. This goes back, it's almost 4,000 years. This is a time-tested formula that the Jews have always used, that is universal in the sense of the life skills it offers us. So I like to use the term for it. Some of you may have heard me say it in some of my classes recently, that just as a body gets soothed and relaxed in a shower or in a spa, so too the soul also needs nourishment. Just as a body needs exercise, hygiene, nourishment, food, vitamins, minerals, a soul also needs that. So we'll call it the spiritual spa for a soul. And SPA is an acronym for study, prayer, action. So in the Mishnah, in the end of the first chapter of the Ethics of the Fathers, it says like this: on 3 pillars the world stands: Torah, study, prayer, and actions, good deeds. If you want a more psychological terminology, cognitive conditioning, emotional conditioning, and behavioral conditioning. This is a secret formula. That's what kept the Jews together. That because the entire universe, and also the mini universe, the universe of microcosm, every one of us stands on these 3 pillars. You immerse your soul in this spa every day, which simply means we're not talking about quantity, even if it's 5 minutes a day, but it has to be every day. The key here is routine. Make it part of your routine, part of your habit. That every day, extra amount of study, which is getting your mindset in the right place. And I don't mean just studying anything, studying something that elevates you, that lifts you up, something transcendent, something that gives you a vision, a bird's eye view of reality. And a few minutes a day prayer, the P, SPA, SP, prayer, which is emotional conditioning. That's what it says. Avodah shebelev zuhi tefillah. What's emotional condition? Getting your heart in the right place. We all can put our minds in a place. It's harder sometimes emotionally. But emotions means that you engage and you emote, whether it's with your soul or with God or whatever speaks to you, the higher reality, the essence, the indeterministic energies, however you want to put it. And finally, comes down to behavioral, because mind and emotions are critical in life, but at the end of the day, we are people of action. And action means you actually do a good deed, a mitzvah. A good deed could be a little charity, it could be good advice, giving advice to someone, saying a kind word, going out of your way to help another person, serving. These three things are not just nice mitzvahs. I mentioned before, mitzvahs are connections. They connect you to yourself and your soul. They connect you to your purpose in life. And above all, what they do is they nourish your soul. So many people think charity is a good mitzvah. You know why? Because you're blessed, so you're helping others that are less fortunate. That's beautiful. But it's even deeper. It massages and exercises the thing called chesed in your soul. Remember, your soul is made up of components as well. One of them is called chesed. Just like using your mind for healthy things nourishes and exercises the brain, the muscle called your brain, the same thing, the muscle called kindness, is actually exercised when you give. A giving person becomes a healthier person. Simple as that. Now you'll say, I do it for selfless reasons, not for myself. Great. But the fact is it will come back to you because it makes you a better person, a healthier person. And the same thing with all the other faculties, so-called, of the soul. So this is a practical way which takes the holiday power of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchas Torah, all of that, and channels it into the SPA of study, prayer, action on a daily basis. The Modani goes into the category of emotional condition. It's a prayer. So now it's up to you to decide and just make, you close your eyes and make a resolution, figure out something that you'd like to add in your study. Even if you're doing it already, that never hurts to add, especially in a deliberate way, to add into the SPA, the study, prayer, action. This is how the secret of how you maintain inspiration. We all know inspiration is relatively easy. In most cases, easier to inspire someone. But maintenance contracts are far more expensive, far harder, because to maintain inspiration, once it dissipates, once the excitement is over, once you're not going to synagogue or you're not dancing or experiencing something like a shofar blowing or Yom Kippur experience, but that doesn't mean you can't do it in your own life in a personal way. I would just add one more thing, that when you do it with others, it makes it easier, because alone, sometimes you're not motivated. It's like playing tennis with someone else is a lot easier than exercising yourself. You play tennis? Okay, there you go. You beat him? I'm not going to get in between the two of you. Okay, you'll work it out. But the point is having a chavrusa. You mentioned chavrusa, right? Having two people always adds synergy to the experience. So that's another tip. Now, I can go on, as you can see, and I don't want to. I have to exercise some restraint. I know I still have to talk about that thing with the Fabrengens, but I don't. Again, what's the story time-wise?
Well, we were.
And also questions.
Like to hear the Fabrengen story, if you can share a little bit, and then maybe do 10 minutes of Q&A.
Yeah, so I'm going to do it like this because I know. Listen.
We just have a way, and thank you so much.
No, please.
Please go on.
I'm already. I'm winding down. But look, I appreciate your attention. You've been very good audience. But I also know it's always best to leave people wanting more than less. So I will talk about that. But maybe I'll do this. Here's what we'll do. Let me just conclude with a little blessing. Well, you know what? I will take questions. Let's do that. I'll take questions now, and then I'll conclude with a few words. How's that sound? So I just don't want to leave hanging in a sentence. So I'm suggesting to all of us, including myself, that there are ways that you can, my father would always tell me, I always loved this expression, there are three types of people who make things happen, people who watch things happen, and people who ask what happened. If anything, I'm here to tell you that you all have the power to make things happen, to be pioneers in your own way. You don't have to feel like you're a victim of circumstances or a product of other people's lives. You have your unique voice. And now is the best time, right after literally ending the holiday season. Today is like Rosh Chodesh, the new month begins. This is a time where you don't necessarily have the crutch of the holidays to lean on. So now the question is, what are you going to do when you're on your own, so to speak? And you can't. So the answer is that you all have the power within you, the angel, the flower, the music, your unique song to play and sing that enriches all of us. And the way to do it is to turn your day into something magical. There's no reason you can't turn every single day into something magical. And that's by the stimulation that we get, as I said, through the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral, and what we can do and stimulate each other. So with that, I'm going to pause now, take any questions, and then I'll say a few final remarks. And to also tell you that you can always access me, even though, as I said, even though we're here for the evening, but I'm around. So let's go, Mitch.
I have a question. First of all, unbelievable, actually, incredible. Thank you. It's such an effective communication tool to make yourself a bridge, to use humor the way you do. And I've read so much by the Rebbe, but I never saw overt humor like the way you did it. What was his view or reality around that?
He had very good sense of humor, but I would say, he was more of a Moses on the mountain, so he exercised it less than I did. But he had a very good sense of humor, but his humor was never frivolous. It was very much like social commentary. He'd point out things, insights in the bizarre human condition. I don't like to, even though I consider myself a student and I absorb so much, especially in mindset, the methodology, but in the actual form of communication, the Rebbe was more, I would say, like he would speak for, if a brain could go 6 hours easily, not one long talk. There were breaks, songs, l'chaims, but he was coming from a place that you need to really be there. It wasn't user-friendly, let's put it that way. It was intense,
Right.
It was deep. It was very, very complex at times. You really had to be there. It wasn't packaged, it wasn't marketed. I'm not going to say marketing, but I'm definitely speaking, I think, a little closer. We're not as far apart, let's put it that way. But I never saw the Rebbe as being apart. I just saw that he was coming from such a high level place. And really, it was like expecting you to elevate yourself. When you did, it was unbelievable. But he didn't like spoon feed as much.
That was what was so amazing about the talk tonight. It was felt so elevated.
Okay, so what I try to do is bring the two together. It's hard for me to compare because the Rebbe spoke in Yiddish, but if we were speaking in English, his message was extremely relevant, obviously, really personally relevant. But I used a lot more Talmudic statements. If I would, for example, speak of the way the actual Rebbe spoke in a Farbrengen, probably 80% would have been a discussion and explaining a verse and a contradiction and so on. It would be more of a class than a talk. But I'm not comparing. I mean, it's like apples and oranges in a way, but you're asking me to give you a taste. Now, it's magical as well. I remember by the Rebbe's Farbrengen, you felt like you were in a different time and space. It was like, like hearing and we want to compare it, like one of this most amazing concert that just transports you. That was the real experience. But the ideas were very, very philosophical, very, very powerful. The Rebbe was emotional at times, but you wouldn't see it most of the time because you'd see it was more couched in academic language. Even though if you really understood it, you saw the personal side to it. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
No question, just a comment. You are absolutely fantastic. There's a way we can follow you up. Or I could follow you up. Like I said.
You mean like I Dream of Jeannie type of thing?
No.
No, I'm just kidding.
I send people to the Meaningful Life Center all the time because I want them to watch your wisdom. How do we, other than that, how I share you with people who are not looking for you?
It's look, I have, I think, a healthy ego, but this is a little too much for me. I don't really know how to answer that. I think you have to ask some of my friends, maybe Ronnie could help. Yeah, definitely my book, Toward a Meaningful Life. Look, let me be very honest. I don't think I'm not aware of some of my skills and strengths, but I honestly believe the following, something that I learned from my Rebbe and teacher. It's never about you. We're channels. I feel it as a blessing, not when, I understand you're giving me a compliment, but I feel more the compliment is that you can be a conveyor of truths that are greater than yourself. I'm sometimes asked the opposite question. Do you really live up to everything you say? That you didn't ask. I can't say I live up to everything I say because the standards are so high. I'm like one of you. But I think I was blessed to be around the right people in person, teachers, and I think I absorbed and I have a gift to be able to communicate. And I really believe this. I think that without doubt in my mind that every one of you sitting here is, if you want to call me, bottling me, is maybe a version of what I'm communicating here. I'm here to tell you that you have it within you. I'm blessed and I feel God will hopefully bless me with health and long years to continue, and I'm not retiring and I'm doing this. So I anything you share with others, look, I do almost over 10, 12 programs every week. You can find them at meaningfullife.com. There's the book Toward a Meaningful Life, the 60 days, other stuff. If you feel there's ideas that we can take, I have a lot of content that I've created. If you can take that content and sometimes talk about bottling it, maybe packaging it, that you think topics like, just like the first time I came here was because reincarnation was a theme that many people wanted to hear about. So we're happy to partner. If anybody has ideas, share them with us. Listen, we have a certain limited manpower, but we can prioritize. And sometimes it really comes down to, all of you have your sphere of influence. Let's put it this way. There's, what do they call, 5 degrees of separation between all of us on Earth? That's what they say. My point is you all have your sphere of influence. I think if each of you in your way brought to them this message, and again, I don't like to call it my message, but let's call it the message that I'm conveying. That's how we do it. And today with technology, it's not that difficult because you can reach millions and billions of people, to be honest. Once upon a time ago, it was purely word of mouth. Now you can share, each of you can, for example, create an email list or text or social media where you post nice thoughts. If it's coming from me, great. But that's how I would do it. That's the way I would answer your question. Take the message and share with as many as you can. And you never know, there are people who are influencers. There are people who have big following. I'm always open to that. If anybody, I do interviews, podcasts. So if any of you have contacts in that direction, I wasn't going to say this, but since you asked the question, there are many platforms today and you never know who you know. Maybe you give it a little thought. Because I do believe we are all links in the chain. I'm a link to that which I heard and what I learned, and I'm sharing. Each of you has to share with those that you know. There's no excuse for that. That's why we're here. So if the message resonates as it does, as you just described, then I don't have to sell you on it. So you know that already. So now the question is just simply, we have the proof of concept. Now we have to replicate it. So that's how I would respond to your question. But I appreciate your words and I feel touched and humbled and empowered, actually. And I thank you. Thank all of you. Go ahead.
In a world where many Jewish children are leaving the fold, so to speak, in spite of our efforts to bring them into the Jewish fold, Jewish spirit, how do we best manage that kind of a situation where there is no interest, they are resistant, it's important to us, but it's not important to them? What do we do?
The operative word in my mind is always relevance. Relevance. When you have a young man or woman, it could be your child, it could be someone else's child, and they are exposed to Judaism, or to God for that matter, that is somewhat abstract or irrelevant, or even worse, like I described in some of the stories. That's for sure not going to engage them. Now, everybody wants to be engaged by something. When I see someone's passionate about something, I know that they find that thing relevant to them. Now, it may be nonsense. It may be sitting, playing a video game or gaming online for hours and hours. It may be gambling. It may be porn. It may be very destructive things, or it may be more innocuous. So how do we make Judaism fashionable enough and attractive? So I find the only way to do it is make it personally relevant, psychologically relevant, emotionally relevant, and even fun in a certain way. I think when it's presented too much didactically, I mentioned dogma. This is what we must do. We must go Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. That's what Jews do. And the child said, I can't wait to go home to watch the game. Or my friends are doing that, and they're there against their will. So maybe you can keep them there for a little while when they're younger, but you're not creating something they're going to enjoy and they're going to remember. And I think a lot of Judaism, and I don't say only about Judaism, I think religion in general is presented in that fashion. Even those that maintain something, they do it either out of guilt, or I don't want to break my parents' heart, or my grandfather's or grandmother's heart. So how do you make it personal? That's my active challenge every day. Every time I read, let's say, and I want to explain, let's say, the chapter in the Torah, my question, I'll always ask the same question: who cares? Why should I care that this week we're reading that Noah was in an ark protecting himself and his family from a flood that happened thousands of years ago? Not getting into whether you even believe a flood happened. Let's say it happened. Why is it relevant? What do I need to care? What do I care? What happened 4,500 years ago? And if you can't answer that question, trust me, no young person is going to feel engaged or interested. Now, there's always going to be the goody-goodies that are obedient and they just follow whatever you tell them. But most people, especially creative, are going to look for creative channels. I'll tell you a correspondence I had once with Saul Bellow. Remember him? Author, famous author. I read a famous book, was a best-selling book a while back called The Closing of the American Mind. Anybody remember it? So he wrote an introduction, and he wrote that he grew up in an observant home, went to yeshiva in Chicago. His parents expected him to be either a sheikhet, which is a ritual slaughterer, or a chazan, a cantor, or a melamed, a school teacher. But then he says, I discovered truth in the library of the University of Chicago. Where did he discover truth? In Greek philosophy, in Latin, in the arts. And of course, his family was heartbroken, but he discovered the truth, so to speak, the bigger truths, instead of being a sheikhet and so on. I wrote him a letter when I read that. I wrote to him, I said, I'm sorry, I read what you wrote and you've become a famous author and all that, but you couldn't find in Judaism any greater truths. In the Bible, that's the best-selling book. In Abraham, that pioneered all faith and religion for billions of people today. None of it has any universal wisdom and truths. Anyway, I never got a response from him. However, after he died, one of his family members told me that he received a letter and he actually started writing a response. That he could not find it because what was imposed on him was being a sheikh. That's all he heard all day. Your grandfather slaughtered meat, you're going to slaughter meat. Like the story with the woman in Santa Cruz. So I saw, here's a brilliant mind that didn't find it in Judaism, so he found it elsewhere. So I don't really have another formula except making it relevant. I like to believe that psychology and music are the two easiest ways to make Judaism relevant, because both of them speak to people already. People interested in psychology and understanding themselves, and music. And music is essentially soulful and transcendent. That's my general response. But you have to find what the book of Proverbs says, teach your child according to his or her way. You have to find that which speaks to that child. You can't impose on the child your interests. And I say this outside of even Judaism. You want to be a doctor, you want your child to be a doctor. If your child is a musician, you're not going to become a doctor. And you could just make the child miserable because you're imposing what you think should be. So it's critical to understand your child and then feed them interests. And if you can do that through the lens of Judaism and Torah, God, that's, I believe, the key to perpetuating it and in a sustainable way. Because remember, you want them to embrace it once they leave your house, not when you're when you're under your influence. You want them to own it for themselves. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier in the talk that you still have your skepticisms. So I'm just wondering, with all the truth that you've absorbed, like where those gray areas might still remain for you.
You want me to tell you all my skeletons? Just a few? Well, I'll tell you exactly. I remember asking myself when I was 17, 18, can I prove absolutely that God exists? Absolutely. And I came to the realization, no, I can't. Because for every argument for, there's an argument against. Like, what about the Holocaust? What about innocent people suffering? There's always questions. And then I realized something furthermore, that if we could prove that God exists absolutely, then why some people don't accept that? If it's so absolute. So you can say, because it's emotional and they don't want the responsibility. They're not ready to just be objective, so to speak. Or you could argue that that maybe, and I'll put it in the words of one of our cottage atheists called, remember Christopher Hitchens? Christopher Hitchens had a Jewish mother, by the way. Only Jews can be atheists like that. So Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, who's another Jew. Richard Dawkins, the third radical atheist of our time, is, I don't think, Jewish, but they'll probably discover he maybe. But it doesn't matter. You know, a non-Jew could also be an atheist. It's not like. So Christopher Hitchens, before he died, before his time, you know, young, he was asked, what happens if you discover after you die that there is a God? So his answer was, I found very Hasidic. He said, I'm going to ask God, why did you conceal yourself so well? And that is actually what the Arizal, great mystic, says, that God concealed himself so well that we live in an agnostic universe. So once God created an agnostic universe, which means that we could ignore and deny God, that's why you find many people do. And you find even people who are complete God-fearing, I'd like to know, do they live 24/7 and never defy God? If you say someone says, I'm an atheist, okay, you don't believe in God, that's why you're behaving unethically. But what's the excuse of a faithful person behaving unethically? So you have to say that their mind tells them there's a God, but it doesn't come into actions. There is a certain dissonance. So based on that, I came to the conclusion that skepticism, healthy skepticism, is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means the mind is overrated. And a lot of things you can't prove. I can't prove there's love. I can't prove that you even exist. Maybe all this is one big illusion. And we're part of the matrix. And it's a program that, and every proof is part of the program. You can't disprove that. So if you want to go into pure mind games, it's a circle. So I'm skeptical of my skepticism too. Let's put it that way. So I retain that because I don't think I closed my mind, but I made a choice. I would say it's more of a choice. You make a choice that I'm not going to live. I didn't want to live on a fence. It was straggling. Is there a God? I wanted to make a commitment. I needed something that's strong enough for me to say I can live this way. I didn't need absolute proof. I don't need a God that's the result of a mathematical equation. My God, I'd like to believe, is more than a mathematical equation, you know. And more importantly, if you think about it, if God is really God, it's God that created logic and proofs in the first place. So how could a proof prove God's existence if God is the one that created logic? You see what I'm saying? So there are truths that I would say are deeper than just logic. The truth of love, you cannot prove it. You could say, I feel it, I know it. Can you absolutely prove it in a mathematical? How could you prove it? You could say it's mind games. You could say the wiring of evolution that caused two species to meet in order to breed. So nature plays a trick on us to cause us to think we love each other. Schopenhauer actually says that, one of the philosophers. So once you come to that type of place, you realize that life is determined, and I would say most people do not live their life purely based. We're not computers. Most decisions you make are emotional. You hope that the emotions are informed by intelligence, and they're not just impulsive, reflexive, irrational impulses. But at the end of the day, the biggest decisions in life are going to be made by something that's not purely rational. No person would get married if it was purely rational. There has to be something that is, I want to call it madness, but it's definitely something super rational. No, I hope I didn't, and please don't take that the wrong way. I'm married for 40 years, but the more time passes, the more mysterious it gets, frankly. But the point I'm saying is that there are things in life. When I love my child and I'll stay up all night because my child is sick, is that rational? Rational would be no. You know what? The child will get healthy. Tomorrow I got to go to work. I have other things to do. My point is that many big things in life are not, the mind is important, but let's not overrate it. It's not more or less than what it is. It has an important role with rational thinking people. We want to make decisions based on discretion, reflection. You don't want to just be an impulsive creature. But a lot of things we do, and most of the biggest things, decisions, are more than that. And to me, that's what was a bigger proof of God, to me, was that I couldn't prove it than I could, if that makes sense to you. Because there's certain truths that are true because of a certain resonance. But I can't. If someone tells me they just don't believe in God, so I will say, maybe the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe. That's what I would say. But that's most. I'm not going to go try to argue with someone. If that's what they came to the conclusion, whatever reason. Now, I know also many people were hurt by God, or hurt by people in the name of God, I should say. And that's difficult. Someone was really challenged. A person I know, for example, told me his father had Alzheimer's, and he was a really faithful person. He said, if God took my father, I would have no issue. I would be sad. But why would he keep him here without being able to be control over himself? He can't understand the logic of that. So I'm not going to judge him. I'll just cry with him and I'll say, I understand you. And I'm not here to tell you that, you're going to have to fight with God about it, figure it out. And maybe, like every loving relationship has arguments too. We know how to argue with God. So go ahead, go for it. See if you get anywhere. That's my response. So my skepticism is very much part of me. I just don't let it be the driving force of my decisions. I don't want to sit and everything I'm going to hear, I'm going to say, oh, well, you know what, there's always another case. And that way we'll just be indecisive. Like the guy that said, I used to think I'm indecisive. Now I'm not so sure. I don't want to be that person. Okay. Any other questions, my friends?
I have a quick question. I grew up in Muncie, in the yeshiva environment. And not that many years ago, but when I was in yeshiva, it was all about the rules. It wasn't really about the meaning.
Right.
So your approach seems to be trying to find the meaning in it all. So do you think that the meaning has gotten lost, and therefore it was more about the rules, and now the meaning has to come back? Or you have to apply the meaning only when you can't do it based on faith?
I think the meaning, it all began with meaning, and then it turned into laws. And then we were left, for many of us, only with the laws, because that's the nature of bureaucracies. You have a revolution that's built on a driving spirit. And then the nature is, once that revolution takes over and you start building an institution, it starts getting stagnant, corrupt, power, and so on. I think in the time of Avraham Avinu, Abraham, there were no synagogues, there were no rabbis, there were no, so it was purely God. It was a very pure type of experience. But whenever something becomes a community, the challenge is, how do you make sure that it doesn't get caught up in a corporate, bureaucratic, rule-driven system? So I think the rules are necessary. You have rules everywhere. You have rules in the military, you have rules in baseball, you have rules everywhere. But if it's just rules, like I said before, and without the wings, you hear when I gave that analogy? So if you don't have the wings, then you're like, it's like someone playing a piano or an instrument and no music is coming out of it. So I think that Judaism is really a fusion of spirit and action. Spirit is the meaning, the purpose behind it. Like you keep Shabbos, and someone says, I don't know why I'm keeping Shabbos. Why can't I use my smartphone? Why can't I travel? And I can't wait till Shabbos is over, because Shabbos I do nothing. I once developed a theory that maybe that's where the Saturday night fever comes from. Jews who are breaking out of the repression of a whole day doing nothing in their minds. And then, yeah. But then someone says to you, 1 second, Shabbos is a day where you could shut off all the material stuff you're doing and experience your soul. So imagine only having the rule, no work, but there's nothing soulful. You can imagine that Shabbos is not going to be something very pleasant, and no one's going to want to keep it. So I think I think I'm answering your question. I think what's happened is groups gravitate to rules, because rules allow for more control. Rules allow keeping people in line. So though rules have value, but if the rules lose their spirit and their soul. Look at the United States. The United States began a rebellion against England, against King George, because of overtaxation, discrimination, and control. And the founding fathers said, enough is enough. All men are created equal. We have inalienable rights. That spirit is a very powerful spirit that drove this nation. But does that spirit still drive this nation? It's still there. Then once you become a nation, you become your own power. Often then those that were once underdogs, they become the new corrupt ones, So that's the thing that Judaism has to also face itself. Not all rabbis and organizations are ready to say this bluntly. I am. One of the reasons I did not become a pulpit rabbi is because I didn't want to get caught in that type of politics. Now, I'm not saying every rabbi is corrupt. That's not at all what I'm saying. Some are beautiful, great people. I just think it lends itself to a certain bureaucratic side that can become very problematic. So since you went to yeshiva, you know what the rules are. Now is the job is to bring the spirit. That's how I see it. Good? Yeah.
Well, why is Torah compared to music? What's the understanding of music?
First of all, even though he was criticized for it, but King David said, your laws are like music to me. To me, it's because music is like God's music. The world is God's art, music. And when you do a mitzvah, you do a good deed, you're like causing the world to sing. That's how I would put it. So let me just say a few final words, if I may. And I hope I still have your attention. Ronnie, you've heard me so much. Maybe you've heard so much from me, but okay. You got no choice. So I just wanted to say one thing about, since it's intriguing to some, about remembering. And I think it's also an important lesson to all of us. So it's not just something I did. I'll introduce you to a word that I referred to earlier, but I didn't mention the actual word. It's a word used in Hasidic thought, very important word. It's called bittul. In English, it would be spelled B-I-T-T-U-L. That would be the transliteration. And what it means is it's hard to translate in English because maybe the language doesn't tolerate the concept so much. It's a combination of modesty, humility, but maybe above all, suspension of self and self-interest in the face of something greater than yourself. So it's a form of devotion, a form of commitment, but not to yourself, to something greater than yourself. And really is the key to all growth. Because if you don't have that, you can't listen well, you can't learn, because if you think you have it all figured out, it's like if you're a cup that's filled, it can't be filled up with anything. So you have to feel a certain, I would say, emptiness, openness, that you can channel something greater than yourself. This was the key to remembering hours and hours of the Rebbe's talks. Because you see, the brain has like two wheels in it, just figuratively speaking. One is like the absorber of information, and the second is the processor of information. Now, we adults, we process much more than we absorb. Children absorb more than they process because they don't have yet enough information to process. So think of a child's mind like a dry sponge. It absorbs everything. An adult mind is a wet sponge, saturated sponge, because we already have ideas and preconceived notions and prejudices, not necessarily malicious, but the fact is our mind is already has absorbed a lot. So when you hear someone speak, like you're hearing me speak now, you're not just absorbing, you're processing. Like, oh, I like what he says, I don't like what he says. I can answer, it answers a certain question I had, or you fit it into your filing cabinet, your ideas, you fit it into something you know already. When children listen, it may be hard to get their attention, but they listen completely because they have a dry sponge. That's why you can teach a child a new language easily. Try teaching a 20-year-old ABCs. Repeat A 1,000 times. Who's going to have patience? You want to say, how could I make money with this? I don't know. I don't have time for this. Children have that ability to just listen. And their dry sponge of a mind absorbs literally. So when we listened to the Rebbe, we had to like empty the mind from preconceived ideas, which is not an easy thing to do, because when you like what you're hearing, you right away engage with it and you start processing. So the key was not to process, but just to absorb. And the better I was able to absorb and not process, the more I was able to remember. So memory is not a faculty of intellect, it's a faculty of listening, of bittul, of the ability to suspend yourself and respect the space of another. It sounds counterintuitive, but the more I understood what the Rebbe said, the less I remembered it. How do you like that? The things I didn't understand, I remembered best, because if I understood it, my mind was already fitting it into my way of understanding, and I may have missed something. So this was a key element, but let's say this, it doesn't happen automatically. It's not like every time I speak to someone, I turn on the absorber. A lot of times I speak to someone, they say, did you hear what I said? And I happened to be daydreaming or whatever. So, one of the excuses you say, do you mind rephrasing it? Which means you didn't hear it. You're just asking them to, instead of saying, please repeat yourself, can you rephrase it? I'm giving you a way of, in case that ever happens. So they say to me, what do you mean you remember 6 hours of the Rebbe's talks? You can't remember 5 minutes of mine? So I don't want to be the one that breaks it on them, that I don't hear any history unfolding what they have to say. So therefore, I also don't put on that absorber. But when we heard the Rebbe speak, for us, it was like Moses speaking from Mount Sinai. You're not going to hear this again. And if you don't retain it, it'll be forgotten and will never be published. So that's what Shabbos. There was no tape recorders. There were no notes. So that was the work. Now, I have no question there's a gift involved. It's not purely, but there are methods to learn how to be better absorber. If I may, I'll give you an exercise. Can I do that?
Yeah.
Here's how it goes. Take any book you like. You can do this at the leisure, your home, wherever you want. The goal is like this: read the book read a page, open up any page or two, read it as many times as you like, no time limit. The goal is to close it and then write down on a piece of paper what you just read, not word for word, just the flow of the ideas. I've tried this exercise with a few thousand people, not in one group, small groups of 30, 40. And let me tell you, the results are always the same. So before we begin the exercise, I asked the people, what do you think you're going to capture? 100% would be perfect. 1% would be, 1%. Most people say 65 to 75%. Okay, we begin. Everybody opens their book, and I see right away the ones that are the more arrogant or people who think they're the smartest, they do it quickly. Then they close the book and they hold their hands and they're waiting for the inferior others, by 15 minutes, everyone's done, 15, 20 minutes. I can tell you, I don't think I've ever seen anyone reach 75% the first time. And then I ask them to give the book and what they wrote to their neighbor, and everybody shares it. And then I say, okay, evaluate it. How much did what they write capture what it said on the page? The ones that did it the fastest, or the guys that thought they were the smartest, are the ones that their percentages go down direct proportion. To the point, this you won't believe, but this is true. Some people wrote on paper things that contradicted what it said on the page in the book that they were supposed to replicate. And when I asked them, how could you do that? They said, because I didn't agree with it. I said, but that was not exercise. You didn't even listen to my instructions. That's how bad of a listener you are. You didn't even listen to the instructions. This is not about agreeing or disagreeing. You see, they're completely processed. This is about just conveying. You can disagree with it. We're just asking, can you convey something that someone else wrote? That's called lacking bittul. Now, I will tell you this, the second time around, everybody's results are 20% higher. So I can always say 20%, guarantee 20% memory improvement. Try it out. Even after I told you this little secret, you'll see there's a certain, I don't say arrogance, but a certain self-confidence, overconfidence, that we think we're smarter or we're better listeners and better absorbers than we are. Until you don't see how bad of an absorber you are, you're not going to become a good absorber. That's why I used to use a trick question, which I don't do anymore, because I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I used to ask people in the audience, who's a good listener? And it was a trick question. My point was no one that is a good listener is ever going to raise their hand, because you know why? You never ask someone if they're a good listener. You ask their wife if they're a good listener, or their husband, or their friend. How do you know if you're a good listener? You listen to, you need to ask someone else if they think you're listening to them well. Secondly, generally a good listener has bittul, and they're not going to just say, I'm a good listener. There are very few good listeners because it takes training. In our schools, if I would have any say, I would insist that every child is taught to do exactly that. Read, memorize, and put on paper what someone else said, not what you're saying. Time will come to process. I'm not saying we shouldn't process. I process, but I process afterwards. First, you need to absorb, then you process. So there's a statement in the Talmud that says, when you're busy absorbing, you can't be processing. When you're busy processing, you can't be absorbing. It's simply put, you can't speak and listen at the same time. And if anything, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth to listen twice as much as you speak. Okay. That's my take on the listening. There's a lot more to say on this, so I'll leave that for another time. There's a lot to say. I'm actually developing maybe a course or a book on the topic of listening. But I want to say on a final note as a blessing. We're coming from Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, the holidays, and I see them in a universal context. I want to bless each of you that firstly, you should have a healthy year, success and abundance, materially and spiritually, in every possible way. Nachas from yourself, from your family, children, grandchildren, if need be. Those that have to find their soulmate, may you find your soulmate. Those that need a blessing for children or from joy from their children, may that be fulfilled. And basically everything, the whole spectrum of all the blessings that you can imagine in life should be fulfilled this year, all in great joy and in great health. And may we all do, the most above all, fulfill the mission for which we were sent. We are on a mission, each of you, each of us. You matter. I always, in Torah Meaningful Life, I write, birth is God saying you matter. You matter. You're indispensable. You have a music, a song, many songs to play that you and only you can play. And it's an honor to join you in that symphony and play that music together, like I said at the outset. I'd love to hear from you. I'm accessible, very easy. Ronnie here works with me. So if you want more details, she can give you the information. Ronnie's right here, the young lady in the second row. And meaningfullife.com is our website. You can subscribe there. There are many different programs, many subjects. You can ask questions anonymously or not anonymously. And please stay in touch and share. Let us pay it forward. Share it forward and create a ripple effect, a butterfly effect that transforms this entire world and creates a fusion between spirit and matter, between the indeterminism and the determinism. Thank you so much. A very blessed year.